Good evening. And thank you for the invitation to come and talk to the Manchester SciBar. Hear me at the back okay if I talk like this? Fantastic. So, unidentified flying objects. What I'm going to be talking about are UFOs in the conventional sense of the word, and as was said in the introduction, I'm particularly interested in images, and what got me interested in UFOs was, if you look at images, can you tell if they are extraterrestrial? Can you tell if they are terrestrial? Can you tell if they're genuine? Can you tell if they've been faked? But when I started doing a little bit of digging, I found some statistics that really started to worry me. And that's what, I'm not asking for a show of hands, by the way, but when a survey was done in America, I can't find an equivalent survey in the UK, but a survey was done a couple of years ago in America, and people were asked the questions, have extraterrestrial aliens visited the Earth? And what worried me was the size of the response was yes, and it was something like 40% of the American public. And I thought, wow. And then they asked a related question. Even if you think that's happened in the past, do you think aliens are around or visiting us now? And that wasn't much lower. It was 35%. Not only are those worryingly high, in my opinion, but also they are, well, okay, they're lower than the number that believe in ghosts, apparently. That's above 50% in the States. But it is definitely higher than the number that believe in telekinesis and the number that believe in Bigfoot. But if you're a great believer in statistics, this one is the real damning statistic, that the number of people who believe that extraterrestrial aliens are walking amongst us now is greater in America than the number who believe in evolution. Yeah. I'd really like to know what those figures are for the UK or Europe. This particular survey was done by Chapman University in 2018. There might be some statistics for 2019, but I can't find anything equivalent. Maybe no one in their right mind would do a survey like this for Europeans, I don't know. So that's where we're starting from. Quite a lot of people in the world apparently believe that UFOs are extraterrestrial spaceships. And XKCD, which you might know as a web page that produces some wonderful cartoons now and again, made this observation some years ago. If you look at the percentage of people that are walking around with a camera in their pockets, i.e. a smartphone, iPhones kicked off in the middle of the noughties, so before that, not many people walked around with a camera around their neck, except for the odd tourist. Whereas since about the mid-noughties, and certainly now into the teenies and now 2020, 99.9% of the population of most of the Earth have a camera on them all the time. And therefore the question is raised, doesn't that mean that has killed dead the arguments about flying saucers, lake monsters, ghosts, or Bigfoot? Because surely by now, after 10 or 20 years of smartphones, if they really did exist, we'd have some wonderful images and it would be beyond question. So shouldn't the argument be dead? Well, clearly not. If you Google UFO, you find there's plenty of interest there. I found when I did this a little while ago, 250 million web pages are dedicated to UFOs. Most of them are accounts of UFOs that have been seen. Some of them are images that have been taken. Some of them, a very, very small minority, are debunking the UFO myth, but most of them are genuine I've seen a UFO pages. So that implies that despite all of these cameras that exist around the world, no, the argument is not closed. It is still an open argument. So in the next 3 or 4 hours, I'm going to take you through a look at UFOs that are quite definitely man-made objects or natural objects or image artifacts, or the final one deliberately faked, before a closing remark or two about the prospects of UFOs actually being extraterrestrial spacecraft. So I've categorized them, if you like, under those particular headings. So I will, just a word before I start, I'll conform to the usual usage of the word UFO, meaning an object in the sky that is not readily identified. That's how most people use the word UFO. If you believe that UFOs are of extraterrestrial origin, I would side with Carl Sagan, who coined the expression that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So if you really do believe that these lights in the sky are ET, you really need some really solid evidence to back up your claims. Another useful tool for the rational scientist is Occam's razor. So if there are two explanations for a particular observation, then the one that requires the least speculation is the better explanation. Or if you want to get that a little more succinctly, a simpler solution to a given problem is more likely to be correct than a more complex one. So we'll take that attitude when trying to decide whether an image could be extraterrestrial or could be something rather more mundane. That's how you get reliable information about UFOs. You go to your local UFO information center. There's lots of these dotted over Nevada. Less easy to find in the Midlands or the northwest of England. And that's what we would like a UFO picture to be. If UFOs are spacecraft from aliens, that's what we would like to see. That's what a mobile phone camera is capable of producing. A nice, clear, detailed, in focus, no camera shake, well exposed image of an alien spaceship. But as you are probably aware, most UFO images do not look like that. At best, they look like that. They're blurred, they're out of focus, there's always camera movement of some kind. Nobody ever seems to keep their camera still when they take a picture. And if you take a picture at night of a bright object, almost certainly it's going to be overexposed. You make it a little bit bigger, and it tells you absolutely nothing about what that object is. Of the images I found that are purported to be UFOs, 95% of them are useless because you just haven't got a clue what it was that was photographed. It's a blurry something or other in the middle of a field of view in which you can see nothing else. If you had something else, a building or a tree or a person or something, you could gauge a little bit about where it was taken, how high in the sky it was, etc. But a picture like that is virtually worthless. I'm working on the assumption that whatever people say about the pictures they took, it's almost irrelevant, because what people say about, I saw a UFO, it hovered, I took a picture of it, usually their description bears no relation at all to what it is they actually took. And you'll see an example or two of that in a little while. So that is the problem, that most of the time we haven't got enough to work with. I would like to take an image and do some analysis or some image processing to try and decide what it actually is. But 95% of the time, possibly more than that, there's not enough to go on. Here's what I think might be the earliest UFO. You see in the top left-hand corner what is clearly an Apache helicopter. And then next to that, clearly, Luke Skywalker's land speeder. And below that, what could be a Zeppelin or an airship of some kind. When I first saw this image, I thought somebody has just been playing around with Photoshop. But no, that is a genuine hieroglyphic. And then you start to say, well, why have they started chiseling out the outline of a helicopter back in however many millennia BC it was? But it doesn't take too much research to find out what's actually going on there. If you're familiar with your pharaohs, when one pharaoh takes over from another, they usually try to expunge from history their predecessor. And what's happened here is one pharaoh has chiseled out a whole load of hieroglyphics, or at least got his slaves to do so. Another pharaoh comes along and tries to chisel those out and put his own hieroglyphics on top, but doesn't do a particularly good job of hiding the original set. So what we've actually got is two sets of hieroglyphics. And if I put them back one on top of the other and color them differently, you can see how it is we get the illusion of a helicopter or a land speeder or an airship. They are two completely innocuous sets of hieroglyphs that just happen to look very odd when you place one on top of the other. So no, this is not the first recorded UFO in 3000 BC or whatever it was. Let's have a look at a few man-made objects. Here's a very useful chart produced by the US Air Force, and they provided it as an identification chart for those people who think they've just seen the very latest stealth aircraft taking off from a secret base in Area 51. So they provided you with various outlines and basically explained what it is that you're observing. So the first item is a weather balloon. Second item is a weather balloon. Third item is a weather balloon. Fourth item is a weather balloon, not a missile. The fifth item is a weather balloon. Any idea what the next one is? swamp gas. The next item is a weather balloon. No, it's not Batman. Next one is weather balloon. Weather balloon, not the Enterprise. It's a weather balloon. And there's another weather balloon. And so the US Air Force has made it very easy. And it's very nice to get this guide to make it easy for you to tell what it is you've just observed. Very nice of them. But of course, I'm not sure, I've never seen this, but those who have seen this must have thought, wow, that looks like a UFO. This is the launch of a Falcon rocket. And I don't know how many people could possibly ever observe that and not think, wow, that doesn't look like it came from Earth. If you follow it from a launch on Earth into the sky, you can believe it. If you just happen to catch that in the sky, then I'm sure lots of people would have been fooled by that. The exhaust trail of Falcon rockets have a quite characteristic sort of signature as the various stages fall away and the next stage starts to burn. It produces a characteristic sort of exhaust plume, as it were. And if you catch it at the right time of day, at the right time of evening, when the sun is just glinting off some of that exhaust, you can get some incredible images, as was done from various parts of California. And you can't really get the scale, but this is effectively the exhaust plume that's now expanded out once the rocket has reached a relatively high altitude. And again, that looks almost natural, but it's actually a rocket trail. You can get this sort of iridescence where you get these various colors coming out of clouds. You may have seen them yourself. When the conditions are right, you can get ice crystals in the atmosphere that produce these iridescent colors in clouds. In this case, the cloud is artificial because it's a rocket trail. The rocket went relatively straight, but because of the winds at high altitude, the rocket trail gets very contorted over a period of many minutes or indeed hours. And just after sunset, the sun was still catching the top of the rocket trail and produced these wonderful colors. But again, if you get caught off guard, it can be a rather amazing sight and difficult to believe it's a man-made phenomena. It's if you like, a combination of natural and man-made. Natural in the sense of the colors, man-made in the sense of the rocket trail there. And some satellites have been put up in which the satellite goes into the upper part of the Earth's atmosphere, releases various fluorescent materials that are visible from the ground, and these are released at various altitudes, and you can see the different colors at different altitudes, and they're there such that people from the ground can photograph these over a period of time, and you get an idea of how the upper atmosphere is moving and how these particular gases are dispersing in the upper atmosphere. It's basically atmospheric science, but it's done in such a way that you end up with some rather odd-looking colored patches of light in the sky if you happen to catch it, again, within a few minutes or a few hours after these things have been released into the atmosphere. So rather weird appearance, as it were. If any of you are wondering about the little references down in the bottom right-hand corner, if I happen to get these images from the astronomy picture of the day, APOD, I put the date down there so you can go and find more information if you so wish yourself. If you've never visited APOD, I suggest you go and look. apod.gov, a NASA site, wonderful images, a different one every day of the year. And in terms of man-made objects, unfortunately that's going to be increasing with Elon Musk throwing up various small satellites, Google occasionally experimenting with very large satellites, the idea of having phones that can bounce off satellites and hence extend phone coverage across areas which don't have radio masts like we do in Europe. If you're trying to get phone coverage over, let's say, Africa, where you don't want to put a radio mast every kilometer or every 2 kilometers, then the idea of having satellites is a possibly sensible way of getting telecommunication to work over large distances. The downside is these satellites can be confused with UFOs, depending on how bright and how fast they're moving through the sky. Have you ever seen this particular arrangement of dots? Do you know what it is?
Fireflies?
Not fireflies. Drones, yep. Get yourself a few dozen drones or a few hundred drones, put a little light on each one and control each one not with 100 different controllers, but you get them all GPS controlled so they fly effectively in formation. I guess we're going to be seeing more of these because the technology is getting cheaper and cheaper. So it won't be long before you don't just see a little cloud of these, you'll get them in particular shapes. They'll either be advertising in the sky or some entrepreneur will end up trying to make them look like a flying saucer or something like that, so they actually look like a UFO hanging in the sky. So at the moment they're quite novel, but it won't be long before we're plagued with these things all over the place, I'm sure, much to the chagrin of astronomers who are trying to look at the night sky and they find artificial satellites or drones are getting in the way of their beautiful night sky observations. Some people have claimed that they've seen UFO landing pads over, where was this? The Nevada desert, I think it was. And some people have said, I looked down, I was flying from Los Angeles to whatever, Chicago. I looked down over Nevada and I saw what was clearly UFO landing pads. Well, all you have to do is make a note of where you were when you saw them and then go back to Google Earth and look at what's on the ground in that particular part of the country, and then you find what you have, a whole load of very large solar plants, a whole load of mirrors reflecting the sun's light back to a furnace in the middle there, and depending on how the sunlight catches those things, they can look rather odd from a height of a few miles, which of course you are when you're flying over them in a commercial aircraft. So again, not difficult to verify that they are just plain and simple man-made objects. I've already said that part of the problem with looking at UFOs is you can never get a nice, sharp, well-exposed, steady image. Here's a video of a UFO, and you can see that he's got the camera the wrong way around. It's vertical rather than horizontal. Not the steadiest of images. Can't anybody hold a camera steady? And this is claimed to be a clear and obvious set of images of a UFO floating in the distance there. This, I'm not sure how many hits this got on YouTube, but it was at least a 6-figure sum. It might even have been a 7-figure sum. Whether people think this is fantastic, whether people think this is convincing, or whether they're just impressed by the fact that somebody can take a picture of a large fuzzy object at a distance with a camera phone, I don't know. But it wasn't that many days after this was posted on YouTube, despite the many, many hundreds of thousands of hits, that the perpetrators of this owned up and said, sorry guys, it was us. It's the Goodyear blimp. I mean, this is such an obvious thing. You know, if they knew that there was a baseball or a football match going on the other side of the lake, and you know that the Goodyear blimp is going to be around taking pictures from above, and so in this particular case, although the original image is very blurry, the Goodyear people said, sorry, at the time you took that, we were on the other side of the lake. Sorry guys, that is quite definitely us. Sorry to spoil the story. You're not going to sell many newspapers. You're not going to get many YouTube hits. Sorry, but that's us. That's always the problem. The mundane explanation doesn't get you all the publicity that the fantastic explanation gets you. And you can't even rely on mundane objects staying out of the sky. Nike decided to do a publicity stunt, and they took one of their pieces of footwear, they took a trainer, and they attached it to a balloon, and they took it up basically to space. Why they wanted to do this, I don't know. They took it to 100,000 feet. The only interesting thing is if you look up, that's what happens when the balloon goes shreds, and eventually the footwear falls back to Earth. I could not find what happened to the shoe. I do not know if it fell back to Earth and was rescued, or is now in a Nike museum somewhere. But basically, if you look up into the sky, you can get all sorts of odd objects up there. You can't assume that because it's shoe-shaped, it can't possibly be a shoe. It must be something else. No, you have to be careful. Imagine my delight when I started searching and I found something, when I Googled UFO, super clear footage of a UFO. Fantastic, super clear footage. This is obviously somebody with a professional camera who's kept it steady and has ended up imaging a UFO. I thought, wonderful, this is going to be great. So, obvious what it was? Anybody? Anybody guess what that was? Okay, a few minutes later, this guy settles down a little bit and perhaps steadies himself, and eventually we can see what the object is. So what's the explanation? Somebody had a birthday party, possibly Jeremy, possibly Jessica. Somebody had a birthday party and a large J was blown up and got away and floated up. I don't know how high this ended up, but when it's at a distance and the sun is reflecting off it, it can look quite unusual. But it doesn't take too much to figure out that's nothing particularly interesting. I'm sure there's lots of those floating around the atmosphere as we speak. So there's various man-made objects which can be confused with UFOs. What about natural objects? There are actually quite a lot of those as well. So I'm not sure if you're aware of the Cloud of the Month from the Cloud Appreciation Society. Yes, it's real. There is a Cloud Appreciation Society, and yes, they have a web page which is Cloud of the Month. And in January a couple of years ago, they had these beautiful lenticular clouds, often confused with UFOs depending on how they appear in the sky. This one I thought was curious, a very large circle. It's basically overcast, relatively uniform cloud base, but in what appears to be a perfect circle, there just seems to be this little knot in a large circle, almost like a crop circle, but in the sky. And you're thinking, well, you know, it's tempting to look at that and say, well, that can't be natural. I mean, clouds do not form circles. They appear to be usually rough-edged and fluffy, but never perfectly circular. But it's not obvious, but there is an explanation, which with a little bit of digging you can find out, and that is if an aircraft is flying just above the cloud base, not visible, you can't hear it and you can't see it, but if it's just above the cloud base, then the exhaust from the engines can lower the pressure just enough to disturb the bottom of the cloud and produce this little rippling effect. And if the if the plane happens to be circling, waiting to come into a nearby airport, then you can get what appears to be either a racetrack or a perfect circle, which is simply the result of an aircraft that you can't see circling perhaps a few hundred meters above the cloud base. So interesting that you get a very odd effect from a perfectly mundane explanation. Another lenticular cloud came along a few months later, and again that looks on its own, looks rather odd. Some clouds can give you the impression that it's out of a scene of Independence Day and a ship is about to come out of the cloud and come over the top. Some areas you get anti-clouds. These are interesting things. You get a complete cloud base, but then you get a hole cut out of it, like you've got a hole punch from a paper, hole punch, and then poof, a large, not usually circular, usually elliptical chunk taken out of the cloud. These are called full streak clouds. And again, meteorologists understand these. They're not that common. You don't tend to get them in the UK. They are more common in the United States because of the way the winds move over a large continent. But again, if you're interested, these rather odd-looking circular objects in the sky, which might be confused with there must be something, clearly a large ship has plunged through the cloud base and produced this large hole. No, there are meteorological effects that can produce these sort of cloud structures. And in terms of lenticular clouds, like we saw in the left-hand side there, lenticular clouds can sometimes produce absolutely spectacular effects. Like over the top of a mountain, you can get multiple layering of these. And so you get this ridiculous sort of structure which looks like a hat has just about landed. Any fans of Stargate know how the wild ships come down on top of a pyramid. Well, isn't that the same thing? It's easy to believe that this can't be a natural structure, but yes, it's just a meteorological effect. One of the most beautiful pictures I've seen of this series, again from Astronomy Picture of the Day, and there are these light pillars. And if you're not used to these, if you live in high climates where you have a lot of weather below freezing, you're probably used to these. In the UK, not so much. This one was where? Finland, this particular set. If you're used to having a lot of ice in the atmosphere, perhaps you see this quite a bit. For a lot of people, it's a rather spooky sort of thing. You see lines of light coming out from either things that are hidden, or you see them coming out of what appear to be lights on the ground. And this is simply a result of ice crystals in the atmosphere. Ice crystals at the right temperature, under the right condition, can form flat platelets. And therefore, when they're sitting horizontally, they reflect anything simply because you've got lots of small mirrors all aligned roughly horizontal in the atmosphere. So you've got ice up here somewhere, and you're simply looking at the reflection of a whole load of lights on the other side of the houses. You can't see the lights directly, but you can see their reflection reflected off these ice crystals up in the atmosphere. And in some cases you get a beautiful effect. I'm not sure where this one was from. Scandinavia again, I believe. And you get a hint of what's going on, because not all of the pillars are the same color. And after a while you realize a blue pillar is basically a reflection of a blue light. and a yellowish pillar is simply a reflection of a yellow light. Whatever colors you have in the original lights, usually street lights, that's what you will tend to see in this ice pillar structure. And they can sometimes occur at high altitude. Here the ice crystals are very high and are reflecting these lights that you can see directly in the distance there. Some of the lights are green, some of the lights are reddish, some of the lights are bluish, and you can see the lights reflected almost like a mirage up in the sky. And again, if you've never seen this before and didn't know what you were looking at, it would be very tempting to say something very alien is going on up there in the upper atmosphere. Sometimes these ice crystals stay nice and flat and you get a good reflection. Sometimes the atmospheric conditions are such that the ice crystals start to vary a little bit as you go to higher altitudes, and that means sometimes the ice pillars can be very well defined up to a particular height, and then they start to sprout out like trees because the ice crystals are no longer as well oriented, as regimented as they are at lower altitudes, and you get these ice pillars that then seem to branch out into trees. Again, a very alien looking landscape unless you're used to what's going on and you see it not necessarily every day. Even in countries where it regularly falls below freezing, you don't necessarily get these forming all the time. I can't remember, where was this? This was actually America. This was Wisconsin, so the northern states of America. And here's an interesting video. It's simply a house one side and a house the other side, and what's interesting is what's going on in the middle. This guy is videoing, real time, no time lapse, something very odd that seems to be flickering inside the cloud. And in some cases, the sudden change seems to occur over quite a large area. This cloud is actually quite high in the sky, so it's as if something is either moving extremely rapidly, moving and then moving back again, which again is very alien because clouds don't normally do that. Clouds are big fluffy things which get pushed backwards and forwards in the wind. They don't usually flick and then flick back again and suddenly brighten and suddenly become more faint. So this is not particularly well understood, but atmospheric scientists believe that what's actually happening, because this is actually a thundercloud, there are very large electric charges building up in this particular area, and it's at this particular edge of the cloud, again, it's probably ice crystals reflecting sunlight, and those ice crystals are suddenly getting lined up by a very strong electric field, and it's like having a lot of very small mirrors. If you suddenly line them all up, you can suddenly get a brightening or what appears to be an expansion. Probably nothing much is moving other than the ice crystals are flipping backwards and forwards, responding to the changing electric fields that occur in thunderstorms as the electric charge builds up in thunderstorms. So it's only seen occasionally, and that's why you don't see many videos like this, but it's been seen enough times that atmospheric scientists are now trying to get a handle on what's actually going on here. But as far as we know, a perfectly natural effect. I thought this was an interesting account. This is one of those situations where you see the picture and then you read what the person has to say. I'll show you his account before I show you the picture. Nearing the end of the day, I sat down on my deck, facing west. Something caught my eye. It was brilliant white. Has anybody looked west in the last few days at sunset? Okay. In truth, I cannot be sure what it is. My conclusion is a UFO. This is the knee-jerk reaction of a lot of people. If I don't know what it is, it must be a UFO. In other words, they're using UFO as it's unidentified by me, not unidentified in the general sense. I don't know what it is, therefore it's a UFO. My friend thinks the object is as big as 2 airliners. I've got no idea how you judge these things. If you've got a point of light in the sky, whether it is an airliner flying at 5 miles up or whether it's something more extraterrestrial, how on earth can you judge that it's the size of 2 airliners? Anyway, this individual, his friend, thought it was the size of 2 airliners. He disagreed. He thought it was the size of 1. So what do you see in the west half the time if you look at what's the bright object you see in the west half of the year? No? Venus. Venus is in the west half the year. It's in the east it's in the morning sky for half the year. It's in the evening sky in the west for half the year. So it's either in the east or the west. Occasionally it's a little bit too close to the sun, but most of the time it is a very bright object, and it's around at the moment. If you, okay, it was cloudy when I came in earlier, so I don't think you'll see it tonight. In the next couple of nights, if you get a clear night, look west within an hour or two after sunset. The big bright thing that isn't the moon is Venus, okay? And that's what this chap saw. He just saw the planet Venus, which is around pretty much all the time, or at least for getting on for half the year. But despite the fact that Venus is in the evening sky about half the year, people still look at Venus and say, wow, that is so bright, it can't possibly be real, it must be a UFO. So in this particular case, he tried taking a picture with his camera zoomed into the extreme, so you ended up with a rather shaky video, and one frame of the video just about makes out the fact that Venus is not a point of light, it's a planet, and it shows phases like the moon, and in this particular case, the right-hand side of Venus is illuminated and not the left-hand side. If ever you do see Venus in the evening sky, grab a pair of binoculars, because Venus is bigger than you think in terms of its angular size in the sky. Okay, not as big as the moon, but if you get a pair of binoculars, 10 times magnification, if you look at Venus, as long as the binoculars are steady, you can actually see the phases. You can actually see when Venus is a crescent phase, or when Venus is a half phase, or when Venus is a gibbous phase. You don't need a telescope, you just need a half-decent pair of binoculars with a magnification of about times 10. That will show you the phases of Venus. Bear that in mind. So this individual saw Venus, didn't realize what he saw, and thought he had seen something at least the size of an airliner. Well, he's right in the sense that it is at least the size of an airliner. It's actually bigger than 2 airliners. And this is one of the few examples I'm showing which is genuinely extraterrestrial, because it's Venus, not from the Earth. Okay, we've looked at man-made objects, we've looked at natural objects. What about image artifacts? This is getting more and more common because more and more people are taking pictures, not very well, and are coming up with artifacts in their images and saying, I don't know what that artifact is, it must be a UFO. So for instance, there's a classic one. This is not on a camera phone, this is a professional photographer. Back in 1952, mysterious lights in the sky hovered over the Capitol in Washington, D.C., and this was published in papers, and it got an awful lot of interest. But as an image processor, image analyst, a person who's interested in how images are generated, it takes me about 1.5 seconds to realize why we have these lights in the sky here, why they appear to be dotted and hovering around the Capitol. Have a look at the lights in the foreground, take those lights, turn them upside down, take them onto the other side of the film. What have you got? Dot, double dot, 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 etc. It's an absolutely perfect match for all the lights that are down here. It is just a reflection of the street lights in the foreground. Virtually all cameras will have some reflection in the lens. Modern lenses have been designed with anti-reflective coatings to try and minimize the amount of light that's reflected from the lens rather than transmitted through the lens onto either the film or the CCD chip to record the image. Even if they're designed to minimize reflections, if you have lights that are bright enough, you will get a reflection. And this is quite obviously just a reflection of those lights. So anybody that says, wow, weird lights over Washington, isn't spending just a few seconds to think, what else could it possibly be? Again, if you have an artifact, people get very, very excited very quickly. In this case, somebody took this image and said, well, it's clearly a large craft. It came really close to the photographer, i.e. whoever took this believed that this object was flying close to him. And the windows can even be seen in the image. I'm not sure what the windows are. Perhaps the windows is the bright spot. Maybe the windows are these dark regions here. But he believes that this is a large extraterrestrial craft with possible windows and possibly a pilot there smiling at him. And this has clearly come fairly close to the photographer. However, if you look at the original image, not the blow-up of this particular bit of the image, which might be the bit that gets the publicity, if you look at the original image, yeah, okay, there's always a line like that. You can tell when people say 100, not proof of aliens, 100% proof of aliens. Not only that, but aliens is in capitals, so this must be really important as an image. But if you look at the original, there's the moon, and what's happening when the moon goes into a lens, you get all sorts of nasty reflections, and that is just a really weird reflection of a very bright object that happens to be in the field of view. So no, that particular craft did not come close to the photographer. This is one of those examples where what they photograph and what they say are two entirely different things. So in this case, just yet another image artifact, another reflection in this case. A more recent version of the same thing, it's a vertical format, so you can tell somebody's taken it on their phone and is too lazy to turn the phone sideways. So there's a vertical image, and this particular individual saw this rather odd thing in the sky. They thought that perhaps there's a little bit of halo around it as well. So they tweeted, that's what you do these days, what is this in the sky? I took this picture and then I saw this weird thing in the sky. It seems to have an aura around it. Is it a UFO? This was tweeted, and this individual genuinely wanted people to answer rather than just say, hey guys, I've taken a UFO. She genuinely wanted an answer and basically hashtagged it UFO and then hashtagged it serious question. In other words, I do want somebody to tell me whether this is a UFO or not. The other thing you tend to find when people explain how they took the picture, 90% of the time they say, I didn't see it at the time, but look, my picture shows something, and presumably that's because my camera is fantastic. I didn't notice it, but my camera picked it up, so that must be really good at detecting UFOs. As opposed to, I didn't see it, therefore it's most probable that it wasn't actually there, and it's an artifact of what my camera is doing. In this particular case, we can make that a bit bigger. Whether that helps or not, you should see in a minute. That's what was actually there. And again, it doesn't take too much to look at that and say, what's going on here? The sun is shining directly into the lens, having gone through a little bit of the filigree work supporting this particular lamp. What are you going to see if the sun is shining through filigree? You're going to see a sun and a little bit of filigree. It's yet another reflection that happens to be in a different part of the image. It's a really bright object, so even if your camera phone is fantastic and doesn't have much in the way of unwanted reflections, when you have something as bright as the sun shining into the camera, you're bound to get reflections somewhere, usually in the image. Occasionally, the reflections don't actually fall onto the chip and spoil your image, but quite a lot of the time they do. And all you have to do is to look at that and see if it matches up the brightest object in the image, whether that be a street light or whether it be the sun, and very quickly you can determine that, yep, that's just yet another image artifact. This is a real example that I don't understand of how somebody can kid themselves. This is a picture saying clearly this is a very odd UFO in the sky. Whoa. And their description was, you can see power lines in the photo. The wires, absolutely no distortion, indicating that my camera hasn't moved in the slightest because the power lines in this image are absolutely razor sharp, proving that my camera was really steady, and therefore what you're seeing is genuinely extraterrestrial. So based on the wires in the photo, you can tell that we were shooting straight up. And I thought, huh? And I took that image, processed it a little bit to try and make it a little clearer. How clear it will be on this projector, I don't know. But by making it a little bit brighter, I am fairly convinced that's the picture out of the passenger side window of a car, and there's the wing mirror, and there's the road, and there's something on the side of the road, and these wires that show absolutely no distortion are just scratches in the film, and the scratches in the film have got nothing whatsoever to do with what's being photographed. So it's a picture of the road taken out of a passenger window, and this argument that it's clearly sharp and it's clearly taken straight up bears no relationship whatsoever to the actual picture that it's supposed to be describing. And that's part of the problem when you look at accounts of UFOs is, to be brutally honest, you can't believe what people say. One of my favorite images in terms of what's going on, let me see if I can get a prop first. Here's a wonderful image of a rectangular UFO in the sky. A huge slab was seen in the sky, and it was quoted, "It appears to be huge, it appears to be flat and rectangular with lights all around the edge." And some people have said, well, it's claimed that it's an advanced type of spycraft known as a TR-3B. Well, that might be what it is, but it's clearly taken from inside a car because you can see raindrops on the windshield. And the question is, what would you see if you had an iPhone sitting on the dashboard? If you had an iPhone sitting on the dashboard with a little bit of silver around the edge, you would see black and a little bit of silver around the... How stupid can people be believing? I mean, are they really believing what they say, or is the entire world just trying to take a picture and claim it's really weird because if you put it on YouTube, you might get a few hits, or if you put it on Twitter or Facebook, you might get a lot of people to like you? Is that what people are actually doing here? Because I cannot believe anybody can think that a large rectangular slab with slightly rounded corners taken through the windshield of a car could possibly be confused with a UFO, especially when they damn well know they've got an iPhone sitting on the dashboard. So again, I just don't know if this is gullibility or stupidity or something halfway in between. As well as man-made objects, natural objects, and image artifacts, it's always possible that some UFO images are simply faked for the same reason we discussed earlier. People want to have their 15 minutes of fame, and maybe if they fake a UFO image and people believe them, maybe they can make a lot of friends and make a lot of money. Any image which requires somebody to be pointing at the UFO so that you can tell which particular UFO I'm talking about, okay, that's clearly nothing in particular. That, again, very nice image, very nice use of Photoshop, thumbs up there. I think if that had actually happened, we would have heard about it. I think not least by all the people on the freeway there who would have seen it coming out of the clouds. So I think we can take it for granted that anything that obvious would have been on the BBC News, unless you believe in conspiracy theories and believe that all news media would have it covered up as soon as it actually appeared, because our overlord dictator extraterrestrials would insist that all news channels were shut down. What about things like this? This is purportedly a couple of UFOs buzzing Air Force One. Air Force One coming into land, and a couple of rather odd-looking aircraft in the background. Not any US military, as far as I know. But I looked at this, and my immediate suspicion was these objects that are supposedly flying in the background there, they appear to be slightly sharper than Air Force One, which is blurred by distance and atmospheric haze. Why aren't these objects blurred by the same amount? The person who photoshopped this image might have tried to give that effect, but they haven't got it right. The objects are too high contrast, and the objects are too sharp, and there's too much detail compared to the amount of sharpness and the amount of detail that you can see in Air Force One. So this is an example of somebody trying to make the UFOs believable by making them relatively clear. Had they made them more blurry and more indistinct, that might have been a more convincing picture in that respect. And this is one I found interesting. This is the deck of an aircraft carrier with a few F-18s and a helicopter, and clearly they found a UFO and they parked it there. Where else do you put a UFO? This one I thought, well, okay, to my mind this is obviously fake. I thought, can I actually prove it? What I did was look at the intensity, or the brightness if you prefer, the brightness of certain pixels within the image. I chose the dark region just above the F-18 there, and I plotted out how bright is that grey strip if we move a few pixels back and forth along here. So over 70 or so pixels, the grey looks very similar to our eye, but you wouldn't expect every pixel to be the same brightness, and hence it goes up and down and up and down and up and down. That's perfectly normal noise in an image. You wouldn't expect every pixel to be recorded as the same brightness, even if in the original image, the original object, they were. And also, this is not a particularly good image, and it's probably got JPEG artifacts. It's been saved in the JPEG format, which introduces extra uncertainty, extra noise in the image. So that amount of bouncing up and down is perfectly natural for what you would expect from a correct region of the deck. But I did the same thing and looked what's going on next door to the UFO. Next door to the UFO, it varies a bit, and then very suspiciously, dead flat, and then it varies a bit. This is a sure sign signature that somebody has doctored the image. Probably the image of the aircraft carrier, maybe a computer-generated UFO, cut and paste, and then try and tidy up the edges to make them blur together to try and convince you that one is sitting on top of the other. But that is an absolutely screaming shout that something is wrong with this image, and that is, in a court of law, that would be proof that this is not a genuine image, and therefore we can show up some fakery, especially if the person is not very good at digital forgery. Some people are much better than that, and they will hide it much better than that, as you know if you've ever heard me talk about the moon hoax. Here's another one where I wasn't very convinced with the original image, but with a little bit of processing I could see what was actually going on. The original image was taken at night of a black UFO on a black background. Yeah. But there is something there. The camera catches something. So I thought if you expand the contrast, expand the brightness, do a little bit of image processing, it should be possible to pull out what's actually there. And I did that, and lo and behold, there is a black rectangle there. But again, a very suspicious black rectangle. What's going on in the background? Well, you get all of this mottling, which is what you normally get when you take a picture of, let's say, blank sky, or what you get if you have a completely featureless object and you save that image as a JPEG. What generally happens is you introduce extra noise in the image, you introduce extra artifacts. So all of this bubbling, waffly stuff in the background is perfectly normal for a JPEG image. But the outline of the triangle is suspiciously sharp, and you would expect that to be jumping around all over the place as well, but it's almost a razor-sharp edge on that on that triangle, which indicates that that is purely an artifact of somebody taking a triangle, cut and paste on the original image, make it all darker so it seems a bit more realistic, and then claim it's a triangular UFO taken in the middle of the night. Sorry, but no, I'm not convinced. This one is a picture taken out of an aircraft window that shows a UFO shooting by. I'm not much of a PC gamer myself, but I found other people who said, no, that can't be right. That's from Halo, that is. I mean, they took one of the CGI, forgive me if I've got it wrong, aircraft from Halo, troop carrier or something else, and they basically blurred it a little bit, made it a little bit fainter, put it in the background and make it look like it was flying either alongside or in the opposite direction to the aircraft. But the similarities between what that is doing and other known CGI generations, well, again, it's just too close to be believable. And finally, I think this is a good point to wind up. I've said they could be man-made, they could be natural, they could be image artifacts, and they could be, as we've seen, faked. But the fifth possibility is that UFOs are extraterrestrial spacecraft. Let's face it, there are a lot of them around. Here's another identification chart for some of the, what do they call them? The models based on actual sightings. So this is from people's descriptions, not from photographs. We never get photographs that good. But this is from people's descriptions of what they have seen in the sky. Somebody has produced a chart. What I find interesting is A, there's 80 of them, and B, this is set 1. So there's more. So maybe there's more than 100 different types of UFO according to the descriptions, ranging from, you know, car hubcaps all the way up to very complex craft flying through the sky. So, yeah, maybe that's a possibility. Occam's razor says there's far better explanations rather than extraterrestrial spacecraft. And what I really don't like are the sort of programs that you see on TV that say, here's proof of a UFO. We haven't actually got the UFO, but if you look at this particular spot in the forest, you can see that there's a smudge there and a smudge there and a smudge there. Clearly, this was a triangular UFO, and its 3 landing feet landed here. Now, if you can really get 3 smudges out of this picture of a forest, and you don't believe that any picture of any forest can possibly produce 3 smudges like that, then you've got a very limited imagination as to what you regard as evidence, and that, really does annoy me as a scientist, that people will just throw down almost anything, and as long as you say it in a very dramatic voice, people might believe you when you say this could be sign of an alien invasion. The lack of evidence, the lack of proper evidence of UFOs being extraterrestrial does actually raise a question. The number of stars in the Milky Way, roughly speaking, is 300 billion. The planetary systems, a little while ago we thought planetary systems were rare. Now we know roughly 50% of stars have a planetary system. Of those, how many might have a rocky planet like an Earth rather than big gas giants? Again, until a few years ago we weren't sure. Maybe Earths are very uncommon. Now it looks like the number of Earth-like planets is about 1/3 of all of the planetary systems that we see. So there must be about 50 billion Earth-like planets in the Milky Way. And then you've got the big uncertainties on how many of those would life have originated. We have no idea. If you assume, I'm a believer, as in Jurassic Park, life will find a way. Give it the right conditions, life will find a way. Let's assume that 99% of the time it doesn't happen. That means 1% of the time life does get a foothold. That's 500 million planets. How many times does life develop from bacteria into complex organisms? I don't know. Let's assume it's not very common. Let's assume that 99% of the time it doesn't happen. That means 1% of the time it does. That's now 5 million. How many times does that complex life lead to intelligence? I don't know. Let's assume that 99% of the time it doesn't lead to intelligence. 1% of the time it does. 50,000. 50,000 is a shed load of civilizations in our galaxy, especially as some of them will have been around presumably for a long time. They would have had plenty of time to develop warp drive and go zooming around the galaxy, and if not colonize, at least say hello as they pass by. So you may disagree with some of the figures, you may disagree with all of the figures, but the question remains, why have we not been visited by extraterrestrials in UFOs? Why do we have absolutely no evidence, despite all of these people taking pictures? There's no evidence it's actually happened. And that's almost more scary than the possibility that it has. Does that mean we are genuinely alone? Coming back to Carl Sagan, 1994, the Voyager spacecraft takes a picture of Earth. There's Earth, basically 1 pixel. And Sagan summed it up. Let's look again at that dot. That's here, that's home, that's us. On it, every human being who ever lived, whoever was, lived out their lives. On a mote of dust, suspended in a sunbeam. Pale blue dot, 1994. So whether you believe we have been visited by ET, or whether you believe we should have been visited by ET but haven't, there are still a lot of questions to be answered. Thank you for your attention.